Hello, YouTube, and not Patreon, because that is gone now, so I guess the introduction to these, when they do exist, will have to change. This is Nathan P. Butler, and this is our project update for the month of June 2023. It is a little bit earlier in the month than usual, primarily because this is kind of a different one of these. It is also the last regular one of these. You will not see monthly project updates from here on out. I will do updates from time to time, kind of like state of the channel type updates and things like that, but it certainly won't be on a monthly predictable basis anymore now that the Patreon is gone, because the monthly basis really was specifically to make sure that I had a chance each month to thank those who were supporters over on Patreon at the 3 different tiers. But we'll talk more about the end of the Patreon, some final thanks here and whatnot here in a little bit. I'm going to change up the order here and hit the stuff that's not Patreon related first, so that those who don't care about the Patreon stuff, who have heard about it closing for months now, don't have to go through listening to all of that again. So, big picture for me right now is that we are in the midst of summer school. I pretty much always teach summer session. It's decent extra money that we can use for utilities and medical bills and stuff like that throughout the year. I guess not as much utilities, like fixing stuff that is utilized with utilities, like we just had to get a new water heater recently. Stuff like that. So I always take part in that 6-week summer session, and we are rolling along in it as of Wednesday, this Wednesday coming up. We will be a third of the way through already, so it's pretty heavy. I am also, and this is a bit odd, it's probably going to sound a bit odd, I'm also going through what is referred to as online endorsement classes or training right now. You might say, well, wait a second. Don't you already teach full-time online? Why, yes. Yes, I do. I've taught full-time online for 8.5 years now. I've helped develop some of the practices and ideas, especially early on, that we use as the best practices in our program. I've been part of that leadership team and helped train people on best practices of online education. But there is a way in our state to basically add what's referred to as an online endorsement to your certification. So that basically if you were ever looking for a new job or someone looked you up to see what your certification was, it would be there saying, hey, this person is a specialist in this particular thing. But you need to actually go through the training to do that. And we kind of did it essentially sort of on-the-job training, so to speak. So as of now, part of our goal is to have everybody who is in our program have that online endorsement as part of their certification, so that in essence, it's just kind of another indicator that, you know, our teachers are sort of like the elite of the online educators for our particular school system. But doing so means taking, I believe it's 3 online endorsement courses, which thankfully are online, though there are some live sessions. And I'm in the midst of the first one right now that is a 10-week stretch here with a lot of homework to do. So pretty busy right now for sure. But I look forward to having that all eventually out of the way within the next, year or so. And we will get a little brief break at the end of summer term where we get a chance to just kind of relax and recharge for maybe about 2 weeks before jumping into fall term here. I'm not actually sure which one feels more like the vacation. A term where you get about 200 students, but the pacing is much better because it's across 18 weeks for a course, or 80 students, which is much smaller, but crammed into 6 weeks. But it's just kind of like the way that I roll these days. It's what I'm used to. So it just means busy behind the scenes. I did get a chance, though, to get you guys some new content here on YouTube. There's going to be more getting recorded today after this that I will at least tell you a little bit about before I record it. And a little bit of progress on one of those side projects that I've talked about. So before we get into those things, let me note one thing here, and that is where to find me now. As I mentioned previously, my Twitter is now closed. I'm not doing Twitter at all anymore. I'm no longer a twit, at least in terms of social media, hopefully. I do still have my Facebook author page. That is facebook.com/Nathan P. Butler author. If you happen to want to check out things there. I have, of course, my moderating duties where I spend a lot of time over on the Star Wars Home Video Facebook group that is run by Justin Berger over on Facebook. That is facebook.com/groups/SW Home Video. All of these are going to be down there in the subtitles as I'm saying them, of course. And of course, if you want to visit my website, it is nathanpbutler.com, also StarWarsFanWorks.com, also AsagaOnHomeVideo.com. They all point to the same place. I don't do much there, but it does have links to various stuff, and eventually it will have that side project that I'm going to mention here in a moment. So those are the best ways to check in, to keep an eye out. Of course, we also have the YouTube channel, obviously, but the Patreon itself is gone, the Twitter is gone, so I did just sort of want to rearrange the table here and make sure everybody kind of knows where to look. As far as new releases, we had 3 new releases of new episodes of From the Star Wars Home Video Library since the last of these updates. Those were episodes 478, 479, and 480. Yes, we are heading towards episode 500. Who knows how long it's going to take us to get through another 20 or so episodes to get there, because there's not a lot of new stuff coming out. But we are sort of rolling on this whole process of getting towards 500. I know what episode 500 is going to be. I just can't do anything until we actually get there. And I apologize if my voice is getting a little weird. I get sinusy stuff going on. So in episode number 478 from the Star Wars Home Video Library, we looked at the Australian equivalent of what in the US we think of as the PVD release for Video Now of The Story of Star Wars, that 3 PVD, 3-disc set from 2004. It was released over there in 2005, and it was just called Star Wars. It wasn't called The Story of Star Wars. We looked at those differences and whatnot in that episode, but kind of a cool little find from Australia. Then, in episode number 479, we took a look at the rather weird limited edition socks from Rock'em Socks to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi. It was Revenge of the Jedi socks in a VHS-style case in a limited numbered edition that is hand-numbered out of only 100 produced. That was 479. And then episode 480, we took at the Australian DVD release, because I don't think it was released anywhere else, but certainly doesn't seem to have been released in the US, the Australian DVD release of the documentary Heart of an Empire about the 501st Legion costuming group and the development of that over the years. So 3 new episodes, but that's basically been it, because it's been crazy town, like I said, behind the scenes here. However, I did get a little bit of time to work on that side project that's been kind of sitting there for a while that I get to work on in bursts, and that is that spreadsheet. For those of you who are not aware, basically, since A Saga on Home Video 2nd edition didn't have a checklist at the end of it because it would have been enormous and a real slog to put together, unlike the 1st edition that had one, basically I said that I was going to put together a nice giant Excel spreadsheet that would basically be essentially my collection, my way of tracking my own collection with all kinds of information in there that I would then also make available publicly for download, so if anybody else wants to use that as the basis of starting a tracker for their own collection, they can. I had a chance to sit down and run through more episodes of From the Star Wars Home Video Library to start filling in that column of like which episode of the show has which home video items in it for those who want to reference those off of that spreadsheet. So I got a pretty big chunk of that out of the way. I'm still not done with that part of the work, but it's getting there. I'm hoping that within the next few times of working on it, I'll finally reach a point where the next thing will be going through my collection to see what hasn't been put on there to add them, because right now everything that was in A Saga on Home Video 2nd edition is in there, but not necessarily anything newer or oddball that didn't get included before. So before we jump into the Patreon stuff, and anyone who's not interested in that bails, just to let you know kind of what's coming up, the biggest stuff as far as what I plan to be recording sometime soon is, again, 2 new episodes from the Star Wars Home Video Library that I'll record today. One is on the Australian steelbooks from that Disney 100 line to sort of compare them to the American versions, and they have kind of a weird thing to compare actually back to one of the more recent releases that we actually saw from Australia in the recent past, and also take a look at the rather different, compared to the United States, 2015 Complete Saga reissue from Australia. JB Hi-Fi had a nice 2-for-1 deal that Matthew Hardesty pointed me to, and I was able to use that. So for about $100 or so American, I was able to get all 3 of those steelbooks and that Complete Saga set shipped over here from Australia. So pretty sweet deal there. So I did wind up picking up those Australian ones that I considered and then didn't, and then wound up getting again. So those are coming sometime soon. I also plan to do a few more videos looking at some game stuff sometime soon, sort of finishing out some things and broadening some things. My hope right now is to go back to Master of Wills to address some of the stuff from newer releases for Master of Wills, because there's just not a lot of videos about that on YouTube at this point. But then there's also a game here in purple called Thornraver Master of Solace. And in fact, cool thing about that, poof, it's open, is I actually appear in the game. This is me as the so-called disposability rater. They reused some of the community art from Master of Wills to make Thornraver, which is sort of the sequel, and I actually had appeared in the Novus community expansion for Master of Wills as the disposability rater, as a government card, so now I am an Old East card here for Thornraver, which is pretty cool. that kind of makes me wonder if I should make a section on my website along with like the written works and stuff like that, just like, here, weird appearances of me in stuff, or instances where I assisted with stuff, like credits I have for assisting on some like board game rulebook proofing or something like that. I just have never gotten around to doing anything like that. But anyway, I'll be doing some videos with that stuff, and just kind of building a repertoire again of other types of videos that I just haven't had a chance to really do with the Patreon sucking up so much of the time. So those are coming, and if you are not interested in the final thoughts and everything for the Patreon, then now is the time to bail. Thank you for your interest in the projects. We will see more of these types of videos at some point, just not on a monthly basis anymore. Okay, so now let's talk about the end of the Patreon here. Really the last time to talk about the Patreon. I started that back in October 2017, in part because I felt as though we needed a way to sort of supplement income, possibly, if it was successful at all, to try to offset some of the cost of building the collection here, as I was really kind of focusing in on that, and of course we had other expenses and whatnot going on. Just trying to find some way to kind of have some supplemental info without having to get a part-time job outside of, you know, my full-time job, which is already heavy. Already has me on call 8 in the morning to 8 in the evenings on school days, for example. So what I did was I launched the Patreon, and the idea was that I'd have audio commentaries for a tier, it kind of there in the middle. So I'd put like a Q&A for the top tier, give them something a little bit extra, do the project updates that would include the Patreon thanks for everybody, so there could be a lower tier, and basically just kind of organized it such that hopefully it wouldn't be a huge lift, but at the same time it would be able to provide some exclusive content and bring in a little bit of extra income. Over time, that became sort of a heavier lift, I guess you could say, because it wasn't that the amount of time that doing the Q&A videos or the project update videos or recording the commentaries got greater, per se, but that my free time got significantly smaller, which meant that even though they were taking up the same amount of time as before, there was now a greater percentage of what time I actually had to do anything for me. And we just kind of got to a point where every single beginning of the month, the first Sunday, I could assume I'm going to be spending most of that afternoon recording the Q&A and then editing the thing. And then similarly, later in the month, at some point, some Sunday would be taken up, at least in part, by recording the project update. The recording of the commentaries I tended to do at night once my son was asleep, once he was born, because he wasn't born at the time that the Patreon launched. And just trying to hammer those out as well. But it became obvious that it wasn't going to necessarily be something feasible in the long run. And I did wonder how much the content was actually being used. I know that in general, the nobility of the Butlerniverse group tended to range anywhere from about 5 people up to about 15 people at any given time who might be watching the videos. The denizens of the Butlerniverse, along with them, who also got access to the podcast commentaries, I know I was putting them up. I don't know how many people actually listened to them. There wasn't usually a lot of feedback on them other than, you know, somebody asking how to download them or something like that, just the ease of that. So I kind of felt like I was putting in a massive amount of work in what little free time I had for a relatively small audience that hopefully enjoyed the stuff, but still was a relatively small audience. All told, across the entire 68 months, a little bit less than 6 years, from October 2017 up until June of 2023, all told we had right around, I believe, 79 paid supporters total. That's including people who were part of it and then gone, or came in later and stuck around, or back and forth. Just of anybody who ever contributed even $1 through being part of that Patreon. And that's a fairly small audience for the sheer amount of time and effort put in, but I hope that audience gets a kick out of what they got out of it, particularly those audio commentaries, because they're not going to be available anywhere else ever again. That is your way to get it, or was your way to get them. But what I'm doing now is sort of freeing up the time by closing the Patreon. The Patreon has basically been unpublished, which means that in theory it still exists in the ether, but it's not actually out there and available. It's just a way of sort of keeping the creator side of the Patreon account existing if I ever want to reuse it. I don't intend to, but hopefully those who were part of it got something out of it. But its day is essentially past. And looking back on it, was it helpful? Was it beneficial? It certainly was helpful in small doses over time. It did tend to increase our taxes a little bit each year because Patreon doesn't tax when it comes to you. It's something that comes in as untaxed gross income that you then have to declare and have taxed later. So there was sort of a balancing act going on there. And I will say that all told, to kind of put this in perspective from my perspective, all told, over the span of 68 months of doing the Patreon, the total gross income that came from that was still about $300 less than I get teaching 80 students during a 6-week summer school session. So it was useful because, as I've said, I do the summer school session. It's not like I don't find that useful. I certainly do find it useful. But by and large, it was somewhat of a disproportionate feeling type of thing given the amount of time that was being taken up. But definitely helpful, especially in some months where we just got slammed on all sides. And the only way to handle like a new release that was coming was through the Patreon. Or the only way to keep bringing in any type of content to show you guys new stuff was coming through the Patreon. It helped with that kind of stuff. So it's been helpful in doses along the way. Never really took off heavily, but at the same time, I hope that, like I said, I hope that those who got into it enjoyed it. I know I enjoy doing the Q&As especially, so hopefully that was a fun thing for those folks. This is the last of the regular project update videos, but the Patreon itself is now closed, so there is no Patreon thanks at the end of this episode in the credits. Instead, what I want to do is thank those who have ever been a paid supporter of the Patreon here one last time in this video, kind of verbally. I know it is somewhat of a long list, like I said, nearly 80, but I do want to address them here. And I will say that when I do this, these are the same people who, if at some point I were to do another supplemental edition of, a Saga on Home video or something, these people would get thanked on that Patreon thanks credits page. Anybody who wasn't thanked before, I would make sure to add into that listing there. These are the folks who at some point provided some type, again, of paid assistance, paid support, even if it was only $1. And I emphasize that because we had about 10 people, 15 people who at some point signed up, got some benefits out of it, and then bailed before the billing cycle could hit. So they basically got stuff and never actually provided any support whatsoever. That is just the nature of how Patreon works. Unless you are setting it so that it charges per piece of content, you're going to have a situation where there is a single billing cycle. If someone's in it at the time they get billed, if they're not, they don't. So they can jump in and jump out, and as long as they're out before the billing cycle, they got access and never actually paid anything for it. It's unfortunate, but again, that is the nature of the beast with Patreon. I understand that, understood that, and what are you going to do, right? It's just what the platform is. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody who has ever been a supporter, a paid supporter over there on my Patreon. I am going to start with those who provided the least, from what I can tell, the lowest paid support, and build toward those who provided the most. Before I do start running down the list, I do want to thank a few individuals, specifically Benjamin Handelman for being the first Patreon supporter and sticking around for the life, essentially, of the Patreon. The folks who asked a ton of questions for the exclusive Q&As for the nobility of the Butlerverse. People like Jonathan Confer and Innes, who are the most prolific question askers, and Matthew Hardesty, and so on. I appreciate the engagement over the years. So, again, starting from least to greatest, every single one of these people provides some form of paid support, and I do very much appreciate it. I will be using whatever name it showed up when I pulled the file here. So in most cases, it's first name, last name. Sometimes it's username. Sometimes it's just first name. It just kind of depends. But we will build towards the one individual who provided just slightly, by an edge, by a $10 edge, the most support of all since the beginning of the Patreon. So my thanks go to, as I'm reading here, PDOTE. I am assuming that is some type of acronym for something, maybe something of the Empire. I don't think we ever found out, but PDOTE. Candy Cabanas, Casey Uri, Mitch Godfrey, Brian Sales, Brian, as Bryan with no last name listed, Zachary Carruthers, Ivan Nadiro, I'm almost saying that, Nidahiro. Ivan Nidahiro, Ndahiro. Paul Sandy, Levi Bond, Von Linus, Christopher Nelson, David Klink, Tom M., no full last name listed, Caleb Owens, Matthew Haddish, Preston Ellis, John Sullivan, Charles Rowe, Chris Morgan, Pavel Gerasimov, David Bittner, Kai Jacoby, Justin Richard, Martin Dahl, Michael Torson, Jamie Bisson, Ben Whitmer, Daniel Contreras, Dave Broadway, Mark D., Thomas Navin, Ben Abrams, Jacob Kapoor, Tony Jenkins, Jeremy Goss, Alexander Santos, Zach Whitbeck, S.W. Chris, Travis Cook, Story Mode, Jared Rasher, Kevin Kreener, Joseph Blankenship, Nathan W. Mortimer, Pantastic Noodles. Now I know I'd remember that name, so I'm sure it was under a different name at some point. Austin Pierce, Chris Lewis, Sky Tri Pallasmere, I never did quite figure out how I'm supposed to say that, Daniel Marchant, Craig Clayton, Ben P. Stein, Andrew Gilbertson, Joe Belich, Travis Taylor, Veghead, David Ray, Big Mac Davis, Matt DeRocher, Jeff Ellis, Walker Langstrat, Gary Sherwood, Jeff Rabjohns, Jeremiah Mustard, Kyle Pellegrini, Bobby Craig, Joey Zitzman, Stephen Malicia, Jana Keller, Robert Medina, Connor Steyerman, Aaron Melzak, Matthew Hardesty, Sam Howard, Brian Snook, Ennis, Jonathan Confer, Benjamin Handelman, and Andrew Bettis. Ben, I think Andrew beat you by like one cycle because I told everybody to bail, and I guess he didn't bail, basically. Yeah, so thank you guys very much, mostly guys. Thank you folks over the years for your support. It has been helpful. I know I sound as though I hope I don't sound ungrateful with the Patreon stuff. In trying to explain why it is ending, it had its time and it certainly was beneficial on my end in its time. I'm glad it was done. It's not something I regret having done. I just think we've kind of reached a different stage, very much like closing down the Twitter or retiring from podcasting or having retired from the timeline stuff. This is another stage of me saying, you know what, here is something else that's on my plate. It's time to have a narrower focus and remove this from the plate as well. But my thanks to all of you who are supporters, whether you were at that $1 tier for 1 month or if you were at that $10 tier for every month. I do appreciate it. And it's humbling to see people willing to actually put their hard-earned dollars into supporting the endeavors that I do, because I've always felt as if this was just kind of like the fun, goofy, dorky hobby that I do, and I'm always shocked by the sheer amount of people who are interested in actually following it or sharing in the discussion or partaking of the content. You know, remember, I'm the guy who back in the day, the original version of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, when it was just a Star Wars Timeline 1.0 up through about 5.0, it was a tiny mailing list, and I sent it through email. It didn't even have a website early on. Back when I started podcasting, we measured our listenership in dozens, and if you breached triple digits, that was amazing. I know it's not a big channel, but seeing over 6,000 people subscribe to the YouTube channel, to me, is almost mind-blowing, especially given the fact that this is not my day job. This is just stuff I do for fun. So I appreciate the support. For the nobility, I hope you enjoyed all the Q&A videos. For the members of the denizens and the nobility, I hope you have enjoyed, or will be enjoying, if you haven't listened to them all yet, those audio commentaries for the Clone Wars, Forces of Destiny, and Tales of the Jedi. And for those who have only been members of the Travelers through the Butler universe, I appreciate your support as well, and I hope you got a kick out of hearing your name and seeing your name in the project update videos up to this point, hearing it on this last kind of weird one. And if you were part of it prior to the publication of A Saga on Home Video 2nd Edition, I hope you enjoyed seeing your name there in print in the thanks, because I do appreciate it. With that, we're going to wrap up this last monthly project update video. Again, the Patreon credits were stuff that I just said out loud for everyone who is a paid supporter. You should not expect to see them in the credits here. This is not a normal type of video in that sense. But I will be back at some point with more content updates, you know, whether it's quarterly, semi-annually, or whatever. I appreciate your time here, and I am going to go ahead and record 2 more episodes from the Star Wars Home Video Library that hopefully you will get very soon. Again, my thanks to you all who are Patreon supporters and who just have enough interest to watch videos like these. And I will catch you, well, not in a month, but I guess when I catch you with another one of these.